think part of pushing yourself creatively is to understand your own tendencies and sometimes challenge yourself to work in direct opposition to that. And in my case, if I don't feel like planning for something, I should see that and say, well, what if I did? What if I planned like a really long project that couldn't be realized for a while? How would that change how I make objects and how I do things in the short term? And I think that's the direction I want to go. I think my process is changing, and with this project, I feel like it says a lot of things that I've been trying to say for years, and it also makes me realize that I'm just getting started. I feel like the rest of my past work is all a pretext to what I want to create in the next decade.
Very much of what I do is about sort of covering things, putting stuff down, and seeing how one color reacts to another, or how one surface reacts to another. And I think that those sensibilities were probably fostered by a real academic training, but I'm working against it. I'm constantly trying, when I'm painting, anytime I feel comfortable about something in a painting, and this is something that I tell my painting classes as well, I have to do something to mess it up, just so I'll react to it. And that becomes a process of creating a structure and then breaking that structure or that rule. And so the end result becomes about some sort of struggle and then resolution of, what should I do, what shouldn't I do, and what happens if I exist somewhere in between those things.
What I really wanted to do is start to alter our perception of landscape, in that if we can shift ourselves out of our normal modes of engagement, because we tend to measure things and have this preconceived notion and process things through this sort of pre-constructed, pre-installed set of notions about where we are and how we engage with it. And if I can make the world seem like, at times, it's moving a little bit faster, a little bit slower, that shifting scales, temporal scales, play with our sense of association between what material and image and even just the physical presence of something is, then I can maybe shift our perspective so when you step outside the gallery, you might just slightly see the world slightly differently. You had just a slight perspective shift. It's the basic idea.
I've always wanted the work to be able to act as a conversation point with the audience. And the thread works that I did were super delicate, and they were fun to make, but they were prohibitive to any kind of public interaction, because if you touched a tangled mass of thousands of yards of thread, that might be it. It might be over. And so plastic units are a way for art to be more formally diverse, but also touchable. And I think that it's been a little bit of a slow process to get it into a purely public realm like the current project is, but that's always been the desire. The repetition can be a part of my process, and it can be a part of the audience or the viewer's personal interaction. And just the suggestion of units, whether it's lines or objects, they can act as markers to indicate volume, distance, and scope. And so those things act as a gesture towards endlessness. And as I've made this piece over the past year and creating drawings and models, I'm more aware of my own influences the more I think about it. And I think one direct application is driving, and sometimes it's hard to get a sense of time when you're driving, but white lines in the road mark the distance, and sometimes if you're like me, you might find yourself counting them to get a sense of locating yourself, I guess. And so I think something in that is coming over to the work, and I think endlessness is something that is also so undefinable and terrifying, and you think about even metaphysical questions and the nature of the soul and where you go when you die, and I think that using a unit that suggests endlessness is a way for me to get a handle on what that means, in a larger sense, without being too specific.
It's very rare that a person can, exist in whatever form they want to, in the world, and also be continually sort of inspired and motivated and sort of questioning the things that they do and the things that they see. And, in some instances, maybe it's sort of a selfish pursuit. I suppose my really early interest sort of came from my father, who earlier in his life was always a painter, and he had sort of gotten me involved. But I think throughout my schooling, I have always been sort of drawn to the arts. I can remember maybe my junior year of high school, I made a very conscious decision to quit the basketball team because I wanted to spend more time drawing. And I suppose that could have potentially been a big stepping stone. A lot of what I'm doing with this present body of work, when I'm thinking about it, is trying to locate abstraction, or let's just say sort of material experiments in painting in the real world, someplace other than just something that exists on the canvas. And I find a lot of inspiration in my own work, noticing things that happen around me, and so, for instance, sort of marks that are made by people not trying to make art. Those sort of moments when marks occur, either utilitarian or otherwise, become really sort of interesting to me, and become sort of fodder for making the painting. So a lot of the things that I notice happen in spaces where we're not looking for art to happen, and oftentimes that becomes sort of the urban environment, or that becomes the built environment. What these sort of interventions that man has that create things without attempting to do so.
The work that I've been doing has always been based around a core set of ideas. And I think that really, ultimately, I'm a landscape artist, which may sound a little bit strange, but it's always been centered on ideas of landscape, but more specifically, perception of landscape, how we interact with it, how it becomes understood within our minds, and how that then becomes manifest in our culture and the way that we engage it. I shifted from wanting to represent specific images and ideas as much, right, that were so specifically referential, right, to say one person's version of, or one group's version of Americanism, right, or some other sort of subset of landscape and human relationships to it. For me, even flying an airplane and looking down and getting a different perspective on the way that we interact, is that sort of perspective shift. It has, in my mind, altruistic, intentions. How they become taken and used, I don't think it's. I can't say for sure. I also don't want to. I have this fear of also being very didactic in what I'm presenting. Right? I don't think that's where I want my work to be, and I also don't want to be dogmatic in pushing my version of an ethic, environmental ethic, or the way that I think things should be. I kind of came into sound a few years ago, probably about 5 or 6 years ago, most dealing with sound as the primary medium with which I was working. It's invisible sound, but if I can make you feel it and almost be able to locate where specific sound waves are because of the way they're reacting with the space in which they inhabit or which they're moving through, and them in relation to one another, then we have this sense of this physical presence that's not tangible in the way that we're used to, but it is sculpture in my mind and not music in that sense.
My graduate thesis committee had one strong recommendation for me when I was finishing school, and they said, your work seems like it's getting bigger. We'd like you to consider bringing other people into your process and just trusting other people to see what you see, and if you can do that, your work will continue to improve. And I really have taken that to heart over the past 5 years, and I want to continue to feel like if the quality of the concept is strong enough, then it's something I should be able to explain and share with assistants in the same way that I want to share that with viewers.
I think it's sustainable is sort of hard for installation. I mean, I don't intend it to continue. It's meant to be sort of fleeting, and it's meant to sort of exist in a space and respond to a space. But I don't see it. At the end of the show, it'll be taken apart and exist in records. But one thing that I think is really nice about it is that that it is fleeting. That it's not around forever, and that it's presented as a response to a situation, and as such doesn't exist as an object in the end.
sound is related to touch. Below 20 hertz, it becomes touch, right? And I found I could generate sounds that would kind of make your knees quake. You could feel it physically in your body. And you can't shut off your ears, like you can close your eyes. I decided, sticking with the time-based media, and then taking a room, the existing architecture in some cases, right? Bouncing sounds around them so that the sound waves become sculpted by the architecture and by what I program within the sound, right? But the space seems very tense and compressed and then opens up, and your whole sense of space, even though you can visually register what's there, right, is shifting around you. And that, for me, has been the most powerful way that I can get at these ideas of perspective shift. Because I work with so much technology, I do so much programming, I work with electronics. One's creative experience, right, has to become this hybrid of like very technical knowledge, of line-by-line based code that has to be written out, and understanding the mathematical equations that affect the production of sound and behavior of sound. And then translating that back somehow into a poetic experience and not an analytic one.
I think the large piece, the sort of installation-based piece came, I can sort of directly point to sort of viaduct under Jackson Avenue up over by sort of Keener Lighting down the street from here, and for a year when I was teaching at the university, I used to live right past that viaduct, and I would ride my bike to work every day and sort of pass by this thing, and it was a wall that sort of constantly changed. It would sort of exist as a mute space. Somebody would tag it. The next day someone would paint over it. And so it became sort of this moving abstraction and these sort of geometric shapes that were a result of people covering up other people's writings, and this sort of continual sort of layering of that thing became really interesting to me, and I think inevitably sort of influenced the way that I approached that installation. I can only control so much, in terms of how I want the work to be perceived. I can explain the genesis of the idea, and I can point to sort of references that exist in the pieces, but at some point my involvement sort of has to stop, and the piece becomes a combination of my intent and what a viewer brings to it. I think that's some of the beauty of abstraction, non-objective painting, however you want to look at it, is that it leaves space. It leaves space for a viewer to enter the work without me sort of pointing to what it needs to be about.
The whole structure will require 12,500 ties, which is more than I've used in the past. I don't think there's anything magic about the number. It's specific to the design of the structure. I enjoy wrapping zip ties around objects. I think there's something very gratifying about the zip sound. It lets you know that work is being done. There's something very gratifying about the sense of control you have with that sequence. You always know what's about to come next, for the most part, and it's fun to create an illusion of control in the art process, since you don't have that in life. And so maybe it's sort of my attempt at escapism. I think people will respond to the craft quality of how it's created, that process. I've had assistants already comment how it's similar to sewing and stitching, and how there are obviously those craft traditions in East Tennessee and in this region. I also think people like experience and tactile experiences. I think it's a very honest, independent, hands-on region, and I think this piece really takes that into account from the start. And so I thought it would be nice for work to be able to be touched, just in this one case.
I think it's sort of a rare and wonderful thing that the museum's doing with this show. It's not often that a city has such a sort of supportive institution to be an advocate for the contemporary arts like the KMA is doing, and I think that if it succeeds at anything, it succeeds in broadening the audience. I think there's a strong arts community in Knoxville based around the university and sort of tangential spaces, but there's such a population that never gets to see the type of contemporary work that's being made, whether that be tied to the university or downtown galleries or just artists that sort of live in the city. And I think the museum is taking a really big step to broaden the audience for contemporary art in a way that since I've been in Knoxville I've not seen.
I think East Tennessee and Knoxville in particular has a really good connection with contemporary art. Part of that is through the continuing voices that come through the university and stay here afterwards. And I think that part of it is location, and having lived in New York, I consider Knoxville to be Appalachian more than Southern, and I consider it to be Lower East Coast in a lot of ways. And so I think that angle helps me see how connected it is in kind of a regional sense. But I think the show is a great tradition for the museum to have.
What's exciting is that to see programs like this that provide a venue for contemporary art, for experimentation, to let young artists who are working in the contemporary arts here in this region to have a voice. The opportunity for real invention in many cases is not going to come in, or at least some sort of novel invention that is worthwhile, right? It's going to come not just in the major art centers, right? And we often become somewhat mired in the thinking around where these focal points, these centers where this is that are largely defining what we think of as contemporary art. I think that there's real opportunity to see how the specifics of the vernacular here, right, of the cultural vernacular, its histories. Those artists that are contemporary artists who are the most well known are largely built upon what I think is the traditional sort of Southern iconography and structures. And I think that's a shame because we live in a much more diverse culture than that. And I think that find some hybridization between those, it really will provide some interesting opportunities. The work that I've seen in the museum and what I understand of this scope of exhibitions happening over the next year or so, I think is very appropriate to actually sort of bridging that gap, where you have a lot of work that comes from a traditional media perhaps, but I think it's presented in ways that are extremely new, right, and challenging. And I think that's what I think the role of these museums should be.
I think, the sort of intensity of the sort of color of Brian's piece, and sort of coming into the space, the proximity of that to the piece that I was doing on the wall, I think is sort of directly influenced by what was already happening in the space, which is, maybe one of the sort of nice things about working sort of intuitively with that piece is sort of, I came in and I had a vague notion about what would happen, but I couldn't say off the bat exactly how it would start. And his piece had such a presence already in the space that I just started painting yellow And it kind of went from there. So I mean, in some instances, it was sort of the beginning of my piece. But you know, it's again, it's sort of nice to be able to respond to the situation.
People have expectations, and the range of those expectations is pretty hard to quantify. I know that interactive work is less prevalent in traditional Southeastern museums, but I know it's been done before. Intention and perception can differ widely. I think that's where your sense of observation comes in, your assessment of the site, whether it's indoor or outdoor, the physical, formal characteristics of where the work will exist, the volume of traffic that will be there, the tendency of people in that region and how they normally interact with work. I think those should all be considered before the work could be called finished. My intent isn't always comprehensive, that I learn something from my audience, and I think that that's important for artists to do, to know that if the work really is going to be a conversation, that you have to be able to listen to what the audience is saying. You have to watch their reactions, even if it's not what you expected.
And that is the risks and perils of experimental work, that you wind up speaking to a smaller and smaller audience. And it's always there. I think that ultimately when my decision has to come down to what's best for the work, that I have to put it there. And maybe if, you know, and I'm always surprised at who becomes interested or engaged with it, or becomes very interested in what's there. It's not a matter of getting, it's a matter of wanting to engage, to participate in the dialogue that exists between the work and the viewer, right? And that's real. I try to remove myself from the equation once it happens, you know, and there's this thing, and there's a dialogue that happens between whoever's there experiencing the work and the work itself. I feel like I'm kind of compelled to not play things as safe, you know. For whatever reason, it's always just been my tendency. I feel like tugging at the margins a little bit. I know there's other ways in which I could probably work that would be more easily understood, or perhaps more successful, you know, in certain ways of measuring success in terms of the art world. But that doesn't do it for me. I can't finish work where I start down that course. I think that our understanding of everything around us is built on pre-built notions and imagination as much as it is direct experience, right? And so we live in our own heads, and our sense of reality is this hybrid of this irrational, of this imaginary, of this dream, you know, sort of situation, right? Preconceived notions, and how we assimilate whatever's in front of us into that sort of structure, all right? And that's what those works are really addressing. I guess I've become very reductive in my thinking, right? Not as didactic in the way that I use symbols and imagery, and left things more open in the way that they can be interpreted, right? Kind of nudging, hinting, suggesting, but leaving room for someone to come in and explore them and see where their own trains of thought. You know, it's sort of a path in which you meander, but what you see along that path is going to be a bit different.
I think the future is more specific to the modular architectural form and less about the zip ties. I feel like this is a project that says everything I want to say with purchased zip ties, and I think that engaging people in a physical way is the direction I'm going. The current influences I have with architecture and design will continue to change my work.
And maybe, you know, some of the beauty about painting is that I can't really articulate what it is that I see in a painting that makes me say, this is done. But I know it.
I think that we need to think a little bit differently about the context of our cultural institutions, you know, in the way that they convey, not only communicate to the public what contemporary art is, but what they also become in terms of representations of our communities and our cities, right? And there's a challenge in that, but I think that also provides an opportunity for a stronger cultural voice, a contemporary voice, to grow within places like Knoxville.